The killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis, Minnesota police while in custody triggered worldwide protests. Many Americans across racial lines united to demand racial equity. The U.S. protests inspired calls for change in a number of African countries where police brutality often goes unchecked. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Straight Talk Africa. I'm Vincent McCory. In a moment, my guests and I will discuss why the killing of Floyd resonated across the continent and what needs to be done to change the culture of police brutality. But first, a look at how the gruesome murder in a U.S. city quickly turned into a rallying cry for social justice across Africa. VOA's Salem Solomon has more.
The protest movement that grew in outrage over the murder of George Floyd, an African-American man who died under the knee of a police officer in Minneapolis, has been felt across the globe. It resonates in Africa, where it not only unleashed protests and a show of solidarity with the U.S. marches, but also debate on issues at home, including police brutality, income and class inequalities, and the bitter legacy of colonialism.
The message was basically that it is one struggle. It manifests itself differently, but it is one struggle. It's a global struggle, and we all need to be talking about it because we all need reform. Every system does need reform.
Demonstrations were staged in Senegal, where people were holding signs that read, "Trop c'est trop," or "Enough is enough." In Nigeria, the killing of a teenager in Lagos by police enforcing a curfew prompted outrage. In South Africa, protesters and political leaders wore black T-shirts emblazoned with the last words uttered by Floyd. In Kenya, protesters gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, holding signs and chanting, "Black Lives Matter," and "Silence is violence." As in many African nations, excessive force by police is an issue in Kenya. According to a report by the Daily Nation, 101 people were killed by police in Nairobi during a particularly bloody 9-month stretch in 2018.
I send all my prayers to every single family, every single person that has lost someone to police brutality, to extrajudicial killings, to enforced disappearances, because these have happened here as well. But I think the pursuit for social justice is relentless, and it doesn't end because the issues that affect our system are so deeply ingrained, and we need to begin to dismantle them one by one, one by one.
There are many connections between social justice movements in the U.S. and in Africa. On June 25th, Congresswoman Karen Bass, the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, celebrated the passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. She said she hopes it inspires a similar change on the African continent.
I think that they can take how important it is to have mass movements, because we moved within 30 days to do this piece of legislation. Literally, it was 30 days after the murder of George Floyd. And our legislative body can take 30 years. We can take 30 years or 30 days. But because of the social pressure, we had to move quickly, and that's why we were able to get it done last night. The protesters, we need them to continue protesting. Of course, we want it to be peaceful, but I will tell you that it was their victory.
For some, the movement has brought back painful memories, but also inspired hope. In 1999, police officers shot 41 bullets at Guinean immigrant Amadou Diallo outside his apartment building in the Bronx, New York. He was holding only his wallet, which police say they mistook for a weapon. Today, his mother says she believes her son's death played a role in advancing social justice.
It's not just U.S., it's also Africa, it's Europe, it's everyone, Australia, everywhere people are marching, protesting in Asia and demanding changes. I believe my son opened the door then, 21 years ago, because that was a conversation without any social media platform then. But the media was really telling about this incident around the world. People were watching, protesting, reading about it. The difference today is because we have social media. And also the difference today is because so many incidents has happened and people have had enough.
In the U.S., police officers are speaking out against abusive tactics like the ones used against Floyd. They say unnecessary violence by an officer is a stain on the entire profession, and they want it to stop.
I'll speak for myself. That is not why I became a law enforcement officer. I don't represent the officers that exhibited tactics that are not part of our training. I don't believe that a lot of things that were done correctly, and I'm appalled by that as law enforcement. Wearing this badge, wearing this uniform, I stand to protect, I stand to serve our community. I'm there for them if they need us.
From Minneapolis to Dakar, from Nairobi to Lagos and beyond, the impact of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement it amplified continues to be felt. Activists in African countries believe the last chapter of this story is yet to be written. Salim Solomon, VOA News, Washington.
Well, thank you very much, Salim, for that report. I'm now joined by my distinguished guests from New York, Lumumba Bandele, National Strategies and Partnerships Director for the Movement for Black Lives Matter. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Gareth Newham. He's the head of the Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the Institute for Security Studies. Also from New York, Yetunde Odbesan Omede, Professor of Global Affairs and Political Science at Farmingdale State College. And last but not least, Irungu Houghton, Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. He joins us from Nairobi. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Now, I want to start with Lumumba.
Yes.
Here in the U.S., we often say that every parent, especially a parent with a son, at a certain time, they have to have that uncomfortable conversation with them about how to respond or react when you're confronted by a policeman. Can you help our viewers understand why?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, and greetings to your other guests. So the uncomfortable talk, as it's been referred to, is a survival tactic that Africans in the United States have had to have with their family members for some time. In fact, since we've been here. To understand that, we have to understand first and foremost that the relationship between law enforcement and Black people particularly has never been one about safety or security. It has always been about control and containment, and control and containment at what cost. And so throughout our history, our lives have always been disposable. The might of law enforcement agencies has always been has always been free to reign just without impunity on our lives. And so throughout the history, we've always had to be able to, we're forced, to tell our children primarily how to live in this world, how to be able to get home alive. And it's not just young men. You know, I have two daughters. I have to tell my daughters often what they need to do to survive. And so we have conversations, and we do these discussions around what your rights are in police confrontation, but recognize that those confrontations and those conversations actually are not just constricted to what your rights are, because the law says the police can do 1 to 2 through 3 kinds of things, but reality says that they go beyond that, and there is no history of accountability for those things. And so, quite honestly, you know, we have to deal with the reality of law enforcement agencies having the ability and having a long history of taking our lives, of brutalizing our lives without any kind of accountability.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to turn to the lady on the show today, Yetunde. The Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen it grow, was founded way back in 2013, and it has spearheaded quite a number of protests over the years but after certain notable killings by the police. But this time around, it looked like it had a certain intensity, a certain urgency. Why do you think that was the case?
I mean, we're in really dire times. This happened around a basically global pandemic.
where people were already frustrated. People were economically down. They were in their houses. And so that frustration, coupled with now seeing such brutality on camera, seeing something that you would not have expected to see, in a sense, in the way and in the manner that it happened, that was so egregious. I think that anger, that frustration, all of that boiled over. And that's when we saw really the result of people's enough is enough. So people took to the streets, and this triggered what we call it, not only a global, I would say a global awakening, but a global protest, because people were upset and people could resonate and feel, and they had empathy with what people were going through here in the United States, and also with George Floyd, a man, regardless of his past, in which the media likes to bring up, was killed, was murdered by the hands of police officers in a way that people felt just disregarded what we call human rights and human life. And for that to be seen, for people to be grappling with how to maneuver with this whole global pandemic that we were facing, I think a lot of people just did not know how to react. Their reaction was a human reaction. And so I think those different factors really kind of pushed this over the edge. And it sort of had a spillover effect.
Yes. And I want to go to East Africa now. Irungo in Kenya, being, on the other side of the ocean, you watched this, you saw the news. How did you personally react? How did you respond to this in your mind? How did you process this, the killing of Floyd?
I think for many people across Kenya, we were horrified, like any person or any community of people that believe in the right to justice and the right to life. So for us, there was just sheer horror. It came also, I guess, on the back of 3 months of police brutality and a demand by a growing number of organizations and the public for professional policing and human rights policing in our own context. I remember the time when George was killed. I wrote an article that actually was headlined to all the George Floyds of the world, including those in Kenya. One of them was a 13-year-old boy, Yasin Moyo, who was shot dead on his balcony with a single shot high-velocity rifle by a police officer as he was really on the balcony of his home. And for many of us, that was a turning point back in May, that something needed to change. We've seen about 22 deaths by unlawful policing just in this period of COVID alone. And if we go back to the beginning of the year, there's been 103 cases since January. Yes. So it is something, sadly, that we are very familiar with and also determined to stop.
Now, going down to Johannesburg, actually, Gareth is in Johannesburg. South Africa has a kind of a different makeup as opposed to, say, Kenya or Nigeria, where we have also seen protests. How did this particularly resonate with the situation in South Africa?
Well, I think like in Kenya, most South Africans were horrified and appalled, and it also happened around a time when we were seeing an increase in police brutality in South Africa. 32% increase in the number of complaints opened against police officers for assaults and other kinds of abuses, and a very high-profile case where a man, Collins Khoza, was inside his home, and soldiers with police beat him to death inside his home. He hadn't broken any regulations. So it really just, struck a spark that this kind of issue was global, it was problematic, and I think really resonated quite a lot with people in South Africa.
Okay, and we're gonna, before we focus so much on the police brutality in Africa itself, I want to go back to Lumumba and ask you this question. There are those who have also said, hey, all lives matter. And sometimes they point to the high rates of homicide among black communities in the inner cities. How do you respond to them?
It's a very enraging distraction because that argument has been presented as a way to distract from the accountability that's being demanded and the justice that's being demanded. The nature of the way the racial dynamic in the U.S. is made up, we're still a very segregated society. So crime, intercommunal interactions happens within communities. Terms that you don't hear are white-on-white violence, but it exists because white people respond to their community members in very specific ways, just as Black people do, but you don't have that. And so the violence within communities, the crime within communities happens because of proximity. And so that argument is really one that is invalid, is really one that actually exists throughout the entire country among all people, but it is presented as a way to try to detract from the police accountability, to detract from the calls to highlight the issues of racial injustice. So it is a huge problem. Anybody who recognizes the way the United States is made up recognizes that those crimes actually exist. If you want to go buy some drugs, a white person, they're not going to come to a Black community to do it. They're going to buy it from a white person close to them. That's how these things work.
Yes. Now, before we get on to the other kind of a part of the conversation, I want us to focus on the police brutality in Africa. We did actually speak to a cross-section of people in the United States and some more across a number of African cities. And so right now, we want to listen to what some had to say. Here's Shafara Dixon in the United States.
Because your dream is attainable, it's just how you go about it. And it's even more damaging when you're a young Black female just trying to attain a dream and somebody tells you, you can't do this, you can't do that, because you're a woman and you're not supposed to be doing this in society roles, and two, because you're Black. And I feel like as a Black woman, you know, those things are attainable. We just need to have a voice, but also try your hardest, push, find connections, find network, find loopholes in order to get to that dream and overcome that oppression.
Well, let me put that to you, Yatunda. That's a lady speaking. Many times you're actually focusing a lot on how the Black men are treated by the police. But you listen to that lady. I don't know if you heard her well. She's talking about even the challenge of being a Black woman in the United States. Can you give us some elucidation on that?
I mean, you know, as you know, just in terms of just equal pay, I mean, Black women, of course, also experience racial discrimination. We also experience sexism. So there's the levels of isms that we also experience in our everyday lives. And so what it does is also a psychological impact when you also see fellow African-American men who are experiencing the discrimination that you experience. But for a woman, there are many things that we have to take on in our society. Many of us have to act as pillars. Many of these women who are left fatherless, who are left without a husband, who are left without a brother, time and time again, you see them on the news camera, carrying their families, having to stay strong in the midst of a community unraveling. So we see that the women have been really the pillar, the support, but have also received not only backlash, but also have sometimes not received the support that is necessary and that is needed for them to continue carrying on the mantle.
Thank you. Irongo, the whole question of police and citizens is something that baffles many. The force with which the police confront citizens, peaceful demonstrations across the continent of Africa. Has this become just part of life that many Africans accept as part of, you know, how they relate to the police? To be beaten, to be brutalized, and nothing is done about it.
So I think, first of all, you need to start probably to understand the phenomenon of police brutality is really to look for the origins of our police services across the continent. They're essentially colonial instruments of control. And as we went into independence, they were harnessed by the neo-colonial elite to essentially control power and the distribution of resources and make sure that they were not distributed very widely across society, but that they were able to maintain really unsustainable levels of poverty and inequality in these countries. And I'm not one that always goes back in 400 years to look at the reasons for why we're in this situation. But I think a historical analysis is very important. A contemporary analysis will tell you, in the case of Kenya, for example, that more than 50% of the population think that if you are rich and powerful enough, that there is one law for you, and that if you are weak and vulnerable, there is another law for you also, and that your ability to avoid accountability under the rule of law depends primarily on how much power and how much privilege you have. And that's the same really in the United States, as far as I can see. it may have a racial dynamic, but here it is a very class-oriented perspective. So the experience of policing by people who live in informal settlements and in rural areas where there is disdain for poor and vulnerable people, and also as a result of poverty, people drift more easily into crime and I guess life options that are not supported under our law, that you will see this level of violence. And I think that's primarily it. I say you can't see levels of brutality from the police in the absence of issues of inequality and poverty more generally. But I think the thing that we have been focusing on, besides the structural issues, is really what are the institutional and behavioral triggers that produce essentially, this set of aggressive warriors in uniform rather than public guardians that are there to essentially disrupt violence and to essentially protect the public interest, not just the elite interest.
Yeah, and indeed, I mean, growing up in Kenya, often had the police say the citizen is the enemy. There's a Swahili expression, raia ni adui, which means the citizen is the enemy, and that is part of their training, I suppose. But before I go to Gareth in Johannesburg, I want to play this soundbite from Nairobi, in the Nairobi informal settlement of Mathare, where we caught up with Wanjiro Wanjera, and here's what she had to say.
I haven't had any experience with racism. I'm black. I'm living in a black country. Police brutality, I am a victim of police excesses. I have a brother who was killed by police. I'm raising my brother's son, and every time I see him, I'm reminded of the bullet that shot him.
Yetunde, looking at the police culture, even in Nigeria itself, where you have roots in, first, it's the level of aggression that you see in them when they're confronting, citizens, perhaps in a situation of protest or sometimes even just a normal arrest. What is it, do you think, that really enrages the police to react the way they do? Is it because they're doing the bidding of the elite who are in power? Or is it also something to do with their conditions of work, that they have a kind of almost a resentment, about what they do?
I think it's a two-pronged situation. As you know, historically, the police has always been used by the government to enforce control by any means necessary. They have not, in a sense, been used or even trained to enforce public safety. What they have been used is to enforce any of the rules and the laws and regulations and oftentimes priorities that the leaders in politics or the leaders in power place. And so they are more so working from the perspective and working from the actions of those who are in power. And so you have that coupled with dire situations, economic situations in Nigeria, where police officers are oftentimes underpaid. They're oftentimes not in an economic position to take care of their families, which adds another level of corruption, where police officers use their position to not only solicit money, but also grease their pockets, because they believe that, well, if I'm doing my job, I'm not getting paid enough money, I'm not being compensated enough, this individual who I'm supposed to be protecting is actually going to serve as a form of supplemental money for me. So not only do you have enforcement of law that is too extreme, you also have corruption.
Well, thank you, Tunde. Now, you're tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of our discussion in a moment, so don't go away. We'll be right back.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. Every week, connect with our experts. You can ask them your questions and get their advice. Join me, Lina Humudu, in Washington on Healthy Living, your new health program, right here on Voice of America.
Well, today we are talking about how the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States inspired calls for a change in a number of African countries. I'm joined from New York by Lumumba Bandele, National Strategies and Partnerships Director for the Movement for Black Lives. From Johannesburg, South Africa, Gareth Newham, Head of Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the Institute for Security Studies. Also from New York, Yetunde Udbesan Omede, Professor of Global Affairs and Political Science at Farmingdale State College. And last but not least, Irongo Houghton is Executive Director, Amnesty International Kenya, and he's joining us from Nairobi. Now, before we went to break, we're talking about the police culture, the training issue, and I want to come to you, Lumumba. You know, some have observed, especially in the recent days after the protests, the whole discussion around police training, even some calling for defunding of police. So some may wonder, is it a question solely of race, or is it all about just the police training? Some have said the police are trained in a way that makes them respond just violently. Some have been just trained to shoot when they feel scared. So is it just about a race issue here, or is it also an issue of training, even here in the United States?
Thank you for that question. It's a series of things. And what you're hearing in terms of the call of defunding is a resolution that we've come to, that the calls for better training, the calls for legislation that would help prevent these kinds of acts have all failed. And so we recognize that what needs to happen is a total reimagination of what public safety actually looks like. The idea of having armed, militarized forces in particularly Black communities to create some level of safety has failed. The belief that police make us safe is one thing that we've all been sort of clinging to, that's really prohibited us from being able to create some other realities, has been proven wrong. I live in Brooklyn, around the corner from a police precinct. That theory should mean that I should live on the safest block in Brooklyn. That is not the case. So this hyper-militarized policing, and understanding that this hyper-militarized policing is specifically in communities of color, especially in Black communities, and does not exist in white communities. When it does exist in white communities, it's to protect them from us. And so we understand that fundamentally there is a problem with the overall framing of what policing has been and continues to be, and that it must be abolished, that we have to reimagine what public safety looks like. And so the next question is, well, what do you do with issues around intercommunal violence? What do you do with issues around crime? We have a number of organizations and initiatives that have been responding to these things. We have an organization in Brownsville, East New York, that's been doing violence prevention and community safety patrols, and they've been able to decrease gun violence in one of the most violent neighborhoods in New York City without law enforcement. We have organizations that have intervened in partner violence and gender violence, and they've been able to do it without law enforcement. We have mental health professionals who are responding to cases to do it without law enforcement. So we have the capacity, we have the understanding of what needs to happen, but this imposition that it has to be a militarized police force is fundamentally the problem. So the call for defunding is rooted in that reality.
Let's listen to what Rachel Motsepe in South Africa, Solomon Ame in Nigeria, and Ruth Emmanuel say about trusting the police.
I don't trust police simply because how they treat young people in our country. It is not as if they are humans.
I do not trust the police. Reason being that it's not all the police that are bad. There are some that are good. But the bad ones have overshadowed the good ones. Because based on my experience during this coronavirus, there are many Nigerian police that uses it as a means of getting money from people, which is very bad. There are some that are doing the job genuinely from their mind.
No, I don't trust the police in our country. The reason being is that I think they are biased. They choose to deal with issues, the way they feel. And as a woman, I think I'm not protected by the police.
I'm fortunate because my dad also is a policeman, and that is why I feel I was fortunate. But some other people who have nobody end up spending days in the station. And
well, so there we've listened to a cross-section of people there. Only one person said they feel a bit safer because their father is a policeman. But if I may come back to Irongo, I think the most common word we had there is, I don't trust the police. I don't trust the police. And the police treat people like they're the enemy. Now, Have you seen any interest whatsoever in the government, say the government of Kenya, in changing the culture of training, of the way the police relate with the citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's sad is 5 months into COVID, for the Kenyan context, I think police, the police were rated at 30% in terms of trust and confidence by the public, and that's the lowest of all the agencies in the country. And given the role of a police service during a time of pandemic, one would have thought that a lot more energy would have gone into making sure that the trust levels and confidence levels would remain quite high. Let me just contrast that with something the Yatunde spoke about, which was that in this period, we've seen a 30% increase in gender-based violence. And many of those cases have happened during the time of curfew, and they've affected people who have no capacity or no confidence to reach out to the police for protection, if not until the next morning or not at all. So, with a rate of, I think it's 5% of the population actually report crimes to the police in the Kenyan context. So there's a real need to think about, what would reestablish trust and confidence in the police service. The police have announced a couple of measures as a result of some of the advocacy that human rights organizations have done, including Amnesty. We now hear that there is an e-learning module that includes rights-based approach to public order management. And this is a response to a 9-point set of policing guidelines that we released on April the 5th that essentially warned the Inspector General what would happen if he did not have a human rights-based and distance-conscious approach to policing during the curfew. So these are some of the measures that are underway. But I think the important thing is, it's not just about retraining. Sadly, we have a number of officers. We have a police service of about 150,000 people. And it's probably the case that, the violence that we see is really manifest by about 10,000 officers. But still, the problem is really that we are recruiting people who really have a mindset of us and them. And no amount of classroom or e-based training will remove that necessarily. What you need is stiff penalties for violating the law. You need swift interdictions or suspensions. And we need to make it very clear that anybody who does not want to work lawfully or compassionately, they must be dismissed and look for another profession to operate from.
All right. Gareth, in South Africa, many people understood that during the apartheid era, the police were trained to treat mostly the Africans as enemy, to suppress them, to brutalize them. Now, the government has been in the hands of a black majority for some years now. Why has there not been any move to change the police culture, the culture of brutality, the culture of treating citizens like they're the enemy of the state?
Well, the dynamics are very different to what occurred under apartheid. So, as I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of efforts to reform the police, train them in human rights, and there's rebranding, and there's a lot of new police officers being recruited. We now also have about 150,000 trained police officers. But around 2011-12, because of high levels of crime, there were sort of political responses. Well, we're going to fight a war on crime, and we're going to bring back military ranks. So we used to have civilian ranks for the police, but in 2011-12, there was this return to military ranks. We had generals and brigadiers. And so that mindset of we're fighting a war, and of course, who are the fight against is the communities, because the criminals don't announce who they are. And so that mindset of being tough on crime and a war against crime, I think did contribute quite a lot to the increased levels of brutality that we have at the moment. And again, we've also got problems with leadership. Yesterday, one of our former national commissioners was dismissed for corruption, and he's the fourth in a row since 2000, in fact, national commissioner to have been fired after an independent board of inquiry following a range of misdemeanors. So there's a leadership issue about how to understand policing and what to do about it. And then as a result, there's very low levels of accountability. So in the last 7 years, there's been over 40,000 formal complaints against the police for assault, for torture. And the conviction rate against police officers is just over 1%, with only about 4% disciplinary hearings. So 95% of the complaints against police go nowhere. And so these various factors mean that we really just need to rely on the goodwill of individual police officers, because the system doesn't make sure that they adhere a certain standard. So not all police officers are bad. Many are doing very good work under difficult conditions and really do try and help people. But at the same time, there are far too many police officials who are corrupt or brutal, and nothing's being done about it. So it does mean that most South Africans, when they see police officials, are a bit nervous. They're not sure how that police official is going to respond. So we do need further reform to deal with these leadership problems and understanding what the police's role is, and of course, end impunity for wrongdoing.
And you know, that's one of the most disturbing things is that if a majority of the police are doing a good job, why is it that the few who soil the name of the police, the ones who give the police a bad name, get away with it? Why doesn't some action be taken so that the culture of impunity goes away? But before we go on to that question, here's a question from Gasheke in Kenya.
Why is Kenya Police Service is corrupt and it has systematic brutality against the citizen? Every time police come out, they clobber people, they abuse them. So what's this violence? What is the history of this violence?
That question, I think we touched on a little bit. The question of when the police come out, it just pounds on the people, clobber them, brutalize them. And Yetunde, here, if you can just kind of, again, put some things in perspective here, the culture, the background, the history of this, just help our viewers understand a little more.
I think you also, historically, you have to also understand that the police have been used as a enforcement mechanism by the government to control people, to enforce their own priorities and their own will over people. They were not created, in a sense, to enforce public safety. They were created to uphold the power of the government. And at times, of course, we know that when that did not happen, they would have their own military coups and turn against people. So the police historically have not been trained in. And look, training is a very, very important. Let's not get away from that, because here in the United States, for instance, you only need a high school diploma and to become a police officer. Of course, you go to police academy, but you don't need a bachelor's degree. That is not the minimum requirement. The minimum requirement is a high school diploma. In addition to that, there's no training in emotional intelligence. There's no training on how to diffuse or de-escalate those who have mental illness cases. There's a lack of understanding of the complexities of the people in which they're supposed to provide public safety to. So the only thing that they oftentimes resort to, which is what they know, is force. And so when we talk about defunding the police, when we talk about training the police, we're talking about changing the culture of using excessive force to de-escalate a situation. Yeah. All situations do not need excessive force, and that is a global issue that we're seeing.
And actually, briefly, before we go to the next question, I wanted to ask you, Rongo, recently in Kenya, we saw the image of a woman being clobbered by 4 policemen, big clubs. Now, what explanation do the police give to that kind of action against a woman kneeling down and being beaten in that fashion? What warrants that?
So nobody has tried to justify the actions that took place against Honorable Mudeo Musiemi this week at the Nairobi County Assembly. And, you know, she was battered severely. I spoke to her within 6 hours of the incident, and she's spoken publicly about the incident. But I think the key thing there is there are a couple of things. One was that a very senior police officer was involved, somebody at the level of a commissioner of police. That's 2 levels down from the inspector general. It happened being filmed by national television, so there was no sense of shame, guilt, or even worry that there would be some consequences for using clubs on an armed woman in the precincts of a parliamentary, precinct. I think the other concern that I've had, and I think this is a gender-based concern, which is that there is a reason why we only have less than 6% of the world's heads of states are women, or that 24% are parliamentarians. And that's largely because many women MPs, parliamentarians, are psychologically and physically abused or threatened with violence while serving their constituents. There was a study in 2019 that suggested that 44% of them have faced threats of death, rape, beating, and kidnapping. And I think the thing that really worries me more than simply the demand for justice that we must ask for Honorable Mudeo Musioni in this case, is that we are essentially seeing what is not just an attack on a woman, but is an attack on the political right of women to stand for political office and to represent constituencies of men and women. And I think that's really what this significant moment is. And I'm hoping that in the next few hours and days, we will see the arrest and charging with assault of those 4 officers.
Okay. Now, here's a question from Chijoke Onobiko in Nigeria.
What are the reforms to actually make us safe to call on the police? Because a lot of things happen. People prefer to take the laws into their hands because they know if they involve the security, the police, they may not get the justice.
Let me just start with Lumumba, this viewer in Nigeria, say, what should be the recourse for a citizen when they need the police, when police always tend to react in such a violent way to a black person? Now, that is on the continent, but even that is the case over here, that some people are even afraid of calling the police.
That is the case, and I do want to lift up the gender dynamic that was raised earlier. Meanwhile, the case of men being brutally killed and beaten at the hands of police is well known, but understand we have a long history from Eleanor Bumpers to Sandra Bland to Breonna Taylor of women who are not exempt from this. And so when I left off my last comment, we were talking about the different community responses to reimagining what public safety is. We can't avoid that. At the end of the day, we're responsible for keeping our community safe. In Movement for Black Lives, we have a saying, who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. And we recognize that policing and over-policed communities don't make us safe. Resourced communities make us safe. So this really is a war against poverty. It's a war against inequality. It's a war against all of those things that create these dynamics that make the police necessary.
Gareth, your response to that question, what can a citizen, an ordinary citizen, do when they need the police and yet they're scared of the police?
Of course, that leads to a whole range of problems for the citizens themselves. In South Africa, we have a problem of vigilante killings. The crime statistics just came out for the last financial year, and we have over 1,000 people have been killed in what's termed vigilante justice, where community members feel frustrated at high levels of crime and violence in their communities. They don't believe they can go to the police, and they take the law into their own hands. So that's a very extreme measure, but it's a huge challenge that we face in South Africa. I think there's very little they can do, because ideally you want your police to be the only legal exercise of violence, and that it's strictly contained and only within the law. So as soon as that breaks down, that idea of the police breaks down, then the state starts losing control, and it hands that control over to militia groups, to local armed groups. So, it's really important that that doesn't happen. And I think, fortunately, in South Africa, our police strategic plan that's just come out for 2021 to 2025 suddenly has, for the first time, recognized how important it is to gain public trust. So they have as a key indicator the number of the proportion of the public who trust the police, who approve of investigations and see the police as professional. So I think in South Africa it's got to a point where they are recognizing that things have to be done differently, otherwise things could get a lot worse here.
Yeah, and that is so sad that most people feel that instead of going to the police, they better take matters into their own hands, because perhaps somebody's going to bribe and get away with a crime, or perhaps you will be victimized by the police again, which is a very, very sad thing. Now, here's a final question from South Africa, and this time is from Kamohelo Malakaone.
If the police system has been defunded, are those funds going to be taken somewhere else whereby the same system has done wrong?
All right. I think the viewer there is talking about the whole question of calling on the defunding of the police, and that is mostly, that has been going around here in the United States. Let's go to Yetunde and just give your thoughts on the very best way forward for changing the police culture.
I think we have to be very careful when we say defund the police, because we do live in a society where we need law and order, right? This is not the Leviathan where we're going to have a society where people are just going to take matters into their own hands. What we need is reallocation of funds. Reallocation of funds, meaning When we take funds away, we need to put them into more training. We need to put them into more workshops. We need them to put them into community policing and providing organizations and civil society organizations that also help to address community matters and work in partnership with the police officers. We need some of that. So we need the reallocation of funds, because the presence of police officers, the presence of law enforcement across the world it's a necessary thing, right, to keep law and order. But at the same time, we have to address the issues of the law and order that's being enforced. And I just want to quickly go back to one thing that the individual, I believe in Nigeria, said. He said they don't even know human rights. Look, when we talk about defunding the police, reallocation of funds also has to go into more educational training for police officers. On numerous occasions, we have seen police officers who are not clear about the law in which they represent, who are not clear about what human rights law is. They don't even have an understanding of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They don't have an understanding of what is the law that actually protects and not only governs themselves, but also governs the citizens and also due process. Many of them are lacking this information. And this is when you have the responsibility of life and death. When that is in your hands, just like a doctor has that responsibility and they have a certain level of education, I also expect law enforcement to have a certain level of educational training so that they understand the laws that govern the citizens and also the laws that govern them. We have a huge gap in police officers and law enforcement truly understanding the law that they represent. And I've seen occasions where citizens are even schooling the police officers on their own rights, in which the police officers have no idea about. So how did we get to this crossroad where we are continuously graduating police officers out of these academies who honestly don't have a true understanding of the law? That's one issue that we need to also tackle, and that has to do with the reallocation of funds, the reallocation of training, and hopefully changing the culture of police and enforcement all over the world.
Now, Irongo, how simple is that? When you consider the fact that there's so many things that come into play, there's the corruption aspect, because the police in many African countries, and we're not able to bring people from all over the continent, but what the issues we're addressing here are very representative. There's corruption that is really a big problem in the police system. There is also the historical background to this, be it colonialism, apartheid in the recent years. How do you change that, even with even if you have the will to do that? How do you change all those things in order to create a police that serves the citizens instead of being the enemy?
So, Vincent, I mean, if it was simple, it would already be done. But I think the first step is really to say that we will not, in the words of Martin Luther King, adjust to see this as normal, as rational, as a part of society that we must embrace and pass on to our children. No, we must remain maladjusted to this. We must remain consciously outraged every time an officer, betrays their oath and their trust. And I think there are probably three things that are the areas of focus besides the great suggestions that Yetunde has raised. I think the first is that the police service must remain closely oversighted by independent policing agencies, specialized agencies that are able to essentially investigate, prosecute, and convict officers that betray their uniform. The second is that the public has to be trained on their rights. And this is something that Amnesty International globally we do. We have probably about 45% of our budgets going into human rights education to generate, to create generations of people that understand that it is not normal for a police officer to extort you for a bribe, or it's not normal for you to be battered by batons or, what look like electricity poles. It is just not normal, and that should not be acceptable in a democratic society.
Yes, and I know.
And therefore, training people on human rights and giving them the confidence to report carefully and safely is the second strategy. And the very last one, really, is making sure that the ecosystem of investigating agencies, prosecution agencies, and the judiciary work effectively. And that's the work, really, of specialized institutions and our elected leaders. but more importantly, I think human rights organizations like Amnesty, Black Lives Matter, and others.
Yeah, and I know you yourself, Irunga, has been bitten by police some time back, I know. But let's go to South Africa. Gareth, we're talking about outrage and the fact that oftentimes the authorities say just a few bad apples in the police system, yet we see the impunity persisting. So why isn't there that outrage from the authorities? Why wouldn't the authorities, the governments, take action against the very few people, indeed, if they're the few people who are kind of messing up with the image of the police?
Well, the government would say that they are, and that every year they'll point to a handful of cases or a couple of hundred cases where police officers are prosecuted or are fired for wrongdoing. But I think it's because the political elite who are responsible for framing what the police do and how they behave don't experience police brutality. As I say, in South Africa, it's very much a class situation. So the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to come into contact with the police or certainly be a victim of any kind of police brutality. The people who are most vulnerable and the most experiencing this are the least organized. So it's your very poor people who don't have a voice. They're trying to live day to day. Just to keep alive, to put food on the table. They're not hugely organized. They don't have money to try and lobby. So I think the political system is one in that until the political elite realize that the only way the police can really play an active role in making society better off, reduce crime, is through a notion of procedural justice, where every interaction that a person has with a police officer must leave that person feeling positive about the police, because that is the only way the police can then play a role in which they model what law and order and human rights are about, and therefore create an environment for people to want to uphold the law and follow the law. When the police are not trusted, when they break the laws themselves, that leads to everybody else thinking that they don't need to follow the law. So it's really at the root of it, it's about a political decision that those with power have to make about what kind of police do they want.
Quickly, Lumumba, what do you make of the fact that your movement, the Black Lives Movement, had this kind of impact across the continent of Africa, that it made people start asking those critical questions?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's welcome, and I think also it's reminiscent of the kind of solidarity that we have seen over the history of the years. And so, you know, we want to take this opportunity to strengthen those ties, to make sure that we make connections. But also want to just clarify that you know, the defund campaign that we are moving, that we're talking about, is explicitly a campaign to make sure that funds are taken out of the criminal justice system, out from policing. So we're explicitly saying things like increased training does not work. It never has worked. It's been tried years and years over again. It does not work. So
but you still need the police, right? Yeah.
Absolutely not, is what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying, that we have to think bolder, we have to think more ambitiously. This idea that police keep us safe has been proven to be wrong within the United States. I can't speak outside of that. But within the United States, the idea that police keep us safe has been proven to be wrong. And as soon as we accept that, then we can really begin to think of some of the other kinds of interventions that we know need to happen. So defunding is not about inserting more money into the police department for trainings and stuff. That's not what it's about.
So, I mean, some people think that is extremely radical. You're suggesting that we shouldn't have the police at all.
Yeah, well, what was radical was the on-camera killing of George Floyd, of Eric Garner. So we recognize that we're in a different place right now. We cannot continue to recycle things that we know have proven to not work.
Is it reasonable, Yatunda, to say that there shouldn't be a police?
I mean, everyone is entitled. You know, there are different pathways to change. So some people may say defund the police, and that is the appropriate pathway to make the necessary changes that we need. But at the same time, I do feel that in the society that we live in and with the Constitution that we do have to have some form of law and order in our society. And the law and order that exists in our society is flawed in a way. And so how do we change the one that is already existing? How do we have them be better police officers? Because we know that we're not necessarily going to probably have a society where we're going to have absolutely zero police officers what we may have is more community policing. We may have more community partners that may be the first line of defense, or maybe the first call that people may make instead of calling police officers. And so, yes, we may need funding for those organizations who may be able to step in and de-escalate situations where the police is not necessary. But when the police are necessary and when they are policing our communities, how do we, in a sense, provide the necessary, I believe, revamp that is needed so that they can be effective in our communities? And I think we have to also look at it in a way that is strategic and in a way that how do we deal with the things that we have now? How do we change what we have now? Yeah.
Let's hear quickly from Irungo. What if you were speaking to a Kenyan police officer? What would you tell them so that when they meet a citizen shouldn't be terrified, shaking in their boots?
So I have this really wonderful experience of working with police officers on all kinds of issues, and some of that relationship is extremely healthy and positive. We delivered gloves and masks to my local police station with a group of community members recently. I have a good relationship with the Inspector General, and as we say, sometimes we have to go head to head on what's happening as a result of his police officers behaving badly. But at the same time, you know, we call out police officers very directly, as in the case of Honorable Mudeo Musiemi. So there are a range of conversations we have with police. I mean, just coming back to the issue of defunding, I think the first thing that I would say is that, you know, everybody has a constitutional right in Kenya to their life and to safety, and that confers a duty on the state, and in particular the police service, to provide that safety and to provide that freedom, you know, from discrimination and from violence. And I think that is the position we've taken with Amnesty, and we will continue to take to ensure that not just you know, that not just the threat of unlawful and excessive force by the police is present for people, but even you know, violent criminals and people who are essentially preying on their neighbors, that also is not an experience for men, women, or people who are non-binary. So I think for us, we would uphold the importance of a police that is professional, that is based on human rights principles, and that ensures that it releases from the community the very best in terms of, I guess, an upholding of the rule of law and protection of all people, regardless of their background.
Yes. Now, Gareth, we have just a few seconds left. Do you think it would help if the police, in part of their training, were helped to understand that actually the citizens pay their salaries and therefore they owe it to them to protect them, to treat them kindly and peacefully?
I think in South Africa, it's less about the training. The police are pretty well trained. I think it's about how they're managed and the way that what's accepted and not accepted by the commanders and I say the political leaders. So if that message was coming from the top and they were being held accountable for misdeeds and recognized and rewarded and promoted when they worked hard and showed themselves to be upholding human rights, that is where the change would come in South Africa.
And finally, Lumumba, in terms of what has been achieved, how can you quickly, you know, in a few seconds, tell us what has been achieved by the recent demonstrations after the killing of George?
Yeah, we saw a phrase and a term that was maybe eight or 9 months ago seemed to be radical. Just saying Black Lives Matter was a radical thing to say. People would be, you know, whitelisted for using that language. Now we see it on the middle of the NBA court. Now we see it being accepted widely. So we know that the environment has shifted, have moved. Hopefully we can see it institutionalized where people really begin to see that we are mandating that the value of Black lives be expressed in real institutional ways.
Thank you very much. This has been a special edition of Straight Talk Africa from the Voice of America. A ton of gratitude to my guests, Lumumba Bendele, Gareth Newham, Yetunde Odbeson Omede, and Irungo Houghton. On behalf of the entire team here in Washington, D.C., thank you for watching, and please continue staying safe. Thanks to our audience for tuning in to Straight Talk Africa.